Can you achieve extraordinary results while making the world a better place? I'm Bruce Temkin, and together we'll explore how. Welcome to Humanity at Scale, Redefining Leadership podcast. Join me as I speak with visionary leaders and top experts to uncover the secrets of humanity-centric leadership. Ready to rethink leadership? Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back. At Humanity at Scale, we dig into what it really takes to lead with purpose, not just driving results, but by building organizations that put people, ethics, and human connection at the core of everything they do. Leadership isn't just about making decisions, it's about making the right ones. Every choice shapes trust, fairness, and culture. But why do we so often clash over what's right and wrong? Why does moral outrage feel stronger than ever? And in a world that feels increasingly divided, how can leaders bridge differences, foster understanding, and create environments where people feel seen, heard, and valued? To help unpack these questions, I'm thrilled to welcome Kurt Gray, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, and director of both the Deepest Belief Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. His research offers powerful insights into how we make moral judgments, build trust, and navigate ethical gray areas, knowledge every leader needs in today's complex world. Kurt is also the author of Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality in Politics and How to Find Common Ground, a fascinating look at why moral and political divides run so deep and how we might start to heal them. Today, we'll explore what his work can teach us about trust, empathy, and how leaders can create cultures where people with different perspectives collaborate and thrive. Kurt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Your research explores the psychology of morality, mind perception, and empathy, which are really cool topics for me. What originally drew you to this field, and was there a specific moment or experience that sparked your curiosity?
There are probably a couple things that really kicked off my curiosity. One goes back to my past, right? When I was a Canadian kid, my dad married my stepmom when I was 5, and she has a big family. They're in Nebraska. They're very conservative. They're evangelical. And when I went down there as a kid, it seemed like I had everything in common with my cousins. We liked playing in the hayloft. We liked swimming in the pond. And then as I got older, it was clear that, my cousins, my family voted differently and thought differently about important issues, at least differently than the progressive academics that I hang around with. And yet I couldn't just write off them as being stupid or evil, as maybe people on the left do, or I couldn't write off my friends as being stupid or evil, as folks on the right often do, right? Confronted with, there's really kind, caring people who vote differently. And so that kind of deep commitment to seeing the humanity in these folks made me realize that I need to figure out how our moral judgments work across the aisle.
So that's interesting. So at a young age, you sort of saw there were differences and wanted to find a way to engage with people that you care about, but not see past some of their differences. Now, how did that grow into sort of leading the lab and becoming an academic and an author on these topics?
Well, I think I've always been interested in I first started out in geophysics, where you're like looking for things in the ground like oil and gas. And I think what's neat about geophysics is that you use all these things to figure out what's in the ground without actually digging, And I think psychology is kind of the same way. Like, you can't dig in someone's head, at least not more than once. And so I felt like there's this amazing field that you can use all these tools to figure out, right, really what people believe, right? The things that people care most about, that they'll live and die for, right? That they vote about. And so I was just amazed that you could have a field that really dug into this and explored it. And then I was drawn to questions of morality, right? How two people can look at the exact same issue, abortion, immigration, and have such different convictions that their view is the truth, right? And like, what an amazing intellectual puzzle. And so I started studying that, again with this understanding of most folks on each side are really, kind, caring folks motivated by the desire to protect themselves and society.
Awesome. So let's dig into that a little bit. What surprises people most about when you talk about how we make moral judgments? Are there common misunderstandings about what our sense of right and wrong actually comes from?
Yeah, I think there are a couple misunderstandings. One is that, especially in today's contentious political climate, one misconception is that, my side's moral and that side is not. That I'm motivated to protect myself and my family and my values and the vulnerable, and that side is trying to burn it all down. But that's not true at all, right? No one gets up in the morning and says, like a supervillain, right? Like, I just want to burn it down. I want to like destroy things, right? That's what I call the destruction narrative, and it's false. And all sorts of research, and even just talking to folks on the other side, reveals that everyone is just trying to protect themselves when they make their moral judgments. So I think that's a really powerful misconception, right? That the other side doesn't hate America. They don't even hate you, right? They're just trying to like get through their day and like, help their kids and keep their job. And right, they're not even like thinking that much about politics on a daily basis. I think the second misconception that I think is really interesting is that the minds of liberals and conservatives can seem so different, like they have different values. But in fact, my research over the past decade and more show that all of our moral judgments are ultimately grounded in the kind of concern about harm and perceptions of harm. Everyone condemns acts that they see as harmful. The problem is that folks on the left and right sometimes focus on different harms.
So if that's the case, why does it feel like there's, and in your book Outrage, which is a great look at this, why does it feel like there's more outrage today in those differences than there were, 5, 10, 20 years in the past?
Yeah, so I think there is a lot of outrage today. I think we've always had moral disagreement, of course, and I think we've always been concerned about threats. I mean, even if you go back millions of years, right, to cave people, we were always terrified about threats, about saber-toothed cats eating our kids, right, about the darkness. And we're safer from wild animals today, of course, right, but we're still worried about things. We're still trying to protect ourselves with all these worries. But the problem is now liberals and conservatives, we inhabit different media ecosystems, right? Social media, cable news, about what the most concerning worries are, right? So maybe progressive news is worrying about, the suffering of migrants at the border or rampant inequality and the effects on the poor, whereas more conservative media thinks about, drug cartel members coming up from the border, right, or people taking away hard-earned money as like taxes increase, right? So we're occupying these like really different understandings of what's harmful to ourselves and to America, and I think that's why we're so polarized today.
So if we live in a world where, let's say there's a simple dichotomy of us and them, and one side of us and them sees a set of items that are threatening them, and the other one sees a different group of sets that's different group of things that are threatening them, then each of those groups sees that if they focus on what the other group wants, then they're going to be threatened, right? If conservatives say, if we look at what the liberals want, then our threats are going to continue. Same thing in the other direction. How do we end up bridging that when that feels like that's a fundamental difference in how each of those groups sees the world and what they need to do to be safe?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first step is really to recognize that the disagreement is not that big. I mean, there are these folks out there in the world, Amanda Ripley calls them conflict entrepreneurs, and they're the folks on social media and cable news trying to get clicks and ad watches and donations, right? They're trying to like really amp up the conflict. But really, we're not that divided, right? Most folks want some kind of safe legal immigration. Most folks want women to have reproductive health benefits, but also don't want kind of really late trimester abortions, right? The zone of disagreement is actually pretty narrow, and there are these trade-offs on either side. So I think the first part is recognizing that we don't disagree as much as we think. We also need to recognize that the other side doesn't actually hate us. Most people on the other side, they dislike you because they think you dislike them, And if you meet someone new at work and someone tells you like, oh, you've never met this guy, but he hates you. You're going to start being like, well, I hate that dude too. I've never met him, but like, look at how he drinks water. Look at how he like walks down the hallway. That jerk. So a lot of this is kind of in our minds. We amplify this debate. But I think the other step, and this is what I've done a lot of research on, is that we wrongly think that throwing facts at folks on the other side is going to convince them. Right? Like we have this conversation about politics and we start off with saying, well, like, here's a stat I learned on NPR or on Fox News, right? Like, here's this thing that's going to like convince you that you're wrong. But no one in a conversation about morality ever says, oh my goodness, you know what? It's like, that's such a great fact or stat. I guess I'll give them my view on abortion. That's not how these conversations work. So I think we need to get rid of that misconception most of all, that throwing facts like ammunition is the way to bridge.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? We like in the history of time, no one has ever given a fact that's changed a person's position like that, but we still use that as the primary challenge. One of the things, so I've looked at the field of like negotiations, and I kind of feel like there's some opportunity there. The idea of interests and positions, right? That negotiators try to get people off of positions, and positions might be on a moral thing like abortion is good or abortion is bad, right? To interests, to what is it that you really want to get out of the discussion? Is there some way to get people to think more about interests and less about positions, get them less locked on those fundamental disagreements?
I love that question, and I hadn't thought about it in that light. But that's exactly what a lot of these interventions do. And so, what I found in my work is that one of the most powerful ways to bridge divides is to tell personal experiences, especially personal experiences that are tied to your feelings of vulnerability, maybe past suffering, concerns, right? So in one study, we had people have a conversation about gun rights, and someone says either, look, I'm pro-gun rights because think of how many times in America, given a stat, people use guns in self-defense. Or I'm pro-gun rights because one day when I was a kid, my mom used a gun to defend herself from a home invader. That's a really different kind of like opening statement. And you might think, well, it's not a fact, it's just a story. But that story seems so much truer. And I think, you bring up this great important point that it really highlights your interests there, right? Your interests are in protecting yourself. And this is what all our moral judgments are about. And so if you can highlight that you're trying to protect yourself, and this story reveals that your interests are not destroying America or hurting the other side, but in like protecting yourself and in like respecting your own family and traditions and feelings, then I think it changes the conversation, right? It's not about two positions, it's about you personally feeling one way about morality and conveying that to the other person.
Cool. So if we could shift the discussion a little bit to groups and leadership. You studied how we attribute moral worth and intention to others, so how we interact with others. How does that influence how we empathize, who we empathize with and who we exclude? And what should leaders be aware of when it comes to these unconscious tendencies?
Yeah. What kicked off, some of my original research way back in grad school was this idea of like, how do we make sense of the minds of others, right? And ultimately, this is like a deep philosophical thing, right? Like the minds of other people are inaccessible. Like you don't know what someone else is thinking. So when I play poker, I think of this, like, I don't know what cards you have, and you could be tricky.
Well, I want to be on record now. I am not playing poker against you. It seems to me like that could be a sub-study of what you're at, how to win at poker by understanding how people make decisions.
Right, totally. But, organizations, So if you're negotiating, that's a really powerful way, right? You don't know what someone's kind of like bottom line is, right? You don't know what their alternatives in negotiation is. Like all these things you don't know. And I think when you're thinking of like who you have empathy for in organizations or who you respect, it's a similar kind of thing, right? Like one person in your team may not correctly perceive the intentions of someone else, right? Because maybe some random thing happened early on in this team formation, right? Where someone like says something was misinterpreted. Things get misinterpreted because we don't understand the intentions of others, right? And it snowballs. And now you've got some real conflict on your team because of something, relatively minor, or maybe they disagree on politics, right? It's something more major. But I think the key there for bridging divides, especially as a leader who needs folks to work together, is to like make people perceive each other's minds more accurately and more benevolently, right? Well, maybe someone did this because they were initially feeling threatened, or maybe they misunderstood where you were coming from, right? To always kind of give the kinder attribution so that folks can work together and kind of achieve common goals and values when working together.
Cool. So in that dynamic of a leader trying to help the people with them, your research has shown that I think power can sometimes reduce empathy. Why does this happen, and how can leaders avoid falling into that trap?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this research, right? Because, when we take the perspective of others is almost a matter of choice, right? And sometimes a matter of necessity. So if you're a relatively lower power in an organization, right, you spend a lot of time thinking about what your boss thinks. Because you want to make sure, like, do I ask them for a raise now? Right? Like, are they angry? Are they kind of annoyed about this? Like, what's the right time? And so you're spending a lot of time thinking about their mind. But if you're a relatively powerful person, you spend less time thinking about the minds and the feelings and the intentions of the folks who work underneath you, right? Because you just don't have to worry about it as much because you're the one with the resources and the control. But I think this can be a bad thing, right, for organizations, because if you're not thinking about, like, are my teammates happy? Are people getting along, right? You can really underestimate the impact of people's feelings and their thoughts as they work. So I think, folks in power often need to motivate themselves a little more to think about the minds of others. But I think we should be motivated to think about their minds because it's like crucial to getting things done. It's crucial to kind of cooperation and kind of, really working together well.
So one of the things I've coached lots of leaders, and one of the things I talk to them about is that the things they do are interpreted in ways that they don't even understand, right? So to some degree, if someone you work with is interpreting your mind, they're doing it through your behaviors. And these might be behaviors and gestures that aren't even reflective of what you're thinking because you're just doing them. How can a leader sort of, in your mind, be more mindful of allowing the people they work with to better understand their internal mind and understand them better?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think so many dust-ups in organizations about, I don't know, I think of like jokes, right? If you're like leader, you're like, oh, I was just joking, but someone's like, I'm reporting this person because like to HR because like I felt threatened and like, was it really a joke? And I think these are kind of flashpoints for the culture war within organizations, right? About watching our speech and political correctness. And even beyond that, just how leaders act, and right, those things get misinterpreted. I think the thing to do is really, to bridge this gap between other minds, is showcase to people, what your intentions are, what your interests are, right? To explain where you're coming from. And I think sometimes leaders worry that makes them look soft or weak, or it takes a lot of time and effort, and often it can. But I think to make sense of where people are coming from is super useful. So I'll give you an example from my own team, right? So I lead a pretty big lab, and there's always funding that's uncertain, and so folks are wondering, like, well, are they going to get raises? Are they going to get cut? What's going to happen? Like, who's going to remain on the team? And so I think, I spoke with folks and I said, look, here's where I'm at, right? Like I only have so many resources and everyone's doing a fantastic job, but you have to prioritize these things. And I'm doing my best to make sure that everyone's happy, right? And so maybe we can even talk as a team about like what we're all feeling and what I'm feeling. So it makes it seem like, I too have emotions and I too have thoughts and concerns for protection of my team. And I'm not just like some cold, person like doing the spreadsheets, right, and the budget balance. So I think that's a good way of just like conveying that you have thoughts and feelings too.
So that's interesting. So we've talked about sort of the role of the leader in this. We've talked about the people who work for the leader in the power structure. And so things like empathy are often discussed like at that individual level. But can it be designed into systems and processes? What does the science say about making organizations more empathetic at scale?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's certainly the case that organizations can facilitate a lack of empathy at scale, right? And I think, one of the biggest organizations that we deal with every day is the United States, right? Or Congress, right? There's been many changes that make Congress less empathic, right? So some examples are instead of kind of living together on the Hill, politicians now go back to their home ridings or constituents, and they don't have to like interact with people who are different than them, right? It used to be that liberals and conservative Congress people had the same, t-ball teams that their kids were on, and they had to figure it out, right? We also have primaries that really encourage kind of the most extreme folks on the left and right to kind of pander to their base. We have an us and them, right? We have two parties. And that may seem far from folks' organizations, right? Companies or nonprofits, but I think you can learn a lot, right? You build structures where it's not an us versus them, and you reward kind of like teamwork and collaboration, even just like some in-person, and I know like return to work, right, it's kind of a hot button issue too, but like just encourage some opportunity for kind of in-person collaboration, even if it's only like, a week per year or per, in my case, semester, right? So I think you need some time where people have kind of not forced interaction, but they're like confronted with each other's humanity. And in a way that doesn't encourage competition, right? So I used to do commission sales in a different life, right? And there, if you structure it a team that like, well, your sale is cutting away this other person's sale because there's only so many people you could sell to, well, that's a recipe for dehumanization, right? So if you make the structures in place that we're not only cooperating, but we're kind of like in it together, I think that's a powerful way to create empathy at scale.
So we have all these sort of, and I love the idea of confronting other people's humanity. I feel like that should be on everyone's OKRs. How are you helping people confront other people's humanity? And so if we think about leaders in this environment where maybe they want to sort of create a more empathetic environment and they understand the us versus them, but they have to make decisions in an ongoing basis, is like, how can leaders make, and let's call them ethical decisions, right? The decisions that have some right and wrong, where there's no clear right answer, right? Where maybe what I need to do for the business seems counter to what I need to do to get people to confront humanity. Any thinking about how they operate in this gray zone?
For the past few years, I've kind of taught some executive education on kind of ethics in organizations. And I love the word, the kind of gray zone, because ethical questions and dilemmas, they are in the gray zone, right? That's why they're dilemmas. That's why they're these questions. And there's really no right or wrong answers. But there are right and wrong ways to present the answers, I think, is the way to think about it, right? So there's competing ethical frameworks, there's competing values. And I think if you make stakeholders aware that you are aware of these competing values, right, then they can perceive you as also grappling with a dilemma, right? If you just come out and you're like, here's the decision, full stop, and you say, well, that seems messed up because what about this other decision? But if you say something like, look, was hard to make this decision because on one hand, there are these questions of like loyalty, let's say, to our team. And, we need to make sure that like the folks who've been with us longest, like, we respect their voice. On the other hand, like there's this other, important thing of like progress and moving forward. And like, we need to like connect our teams to others as we like, I don't know, like join with this other organization. And so like, how do we do that in a way that respects, these folks who are onboarding right now? And it's hard to know how to do that. But, so whatever the actual decision is, right? But you need to kind of like acknowledge competing perspectives and that you are focused on the kind of most ethical way. But it's a matter of gray, as you say.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've read some research that looks at sort of moral foundations, pillars of moral foundations, and some of them are like loyalty and honesty, right? So if you see a friend stealing from work, right? How do you handle the difference between I want to be honest and which means I should expose what they're doing, but I also have this deep sense of loyalty, so I need to be true to my friend and not do that. So how can leaders or really anyone think about when they're struck with a decision that goes against two or supports one moral foundation but goes against another?
In my career, I've kind of argued actually pretty strongly against like these foundations per se, because there's so many values that we could have, right? We could have fealty, we could have punctuality, we could just have like respect of rules, but at the kind of base of all of our moral judgments is about this concern about harm and protection, right? The reason people care about, let's say, loyalty is because they want to protect their friends. The reason someone cares about, following the rules is because they think like, well, you need to follow those procedures to protect the organization, right? Like follow the Constitution because like that's going to have the best, most good for America. And so I think the way to approach any of these trade-offs when there's competing values is to really emphasize your concerns about harm and protection, right? Like at the end of the day, we're trying to protect our employees here, and right, there's different things you could imagine might do that, right? If we follow the rules, generally following the rules that have been really developed by lots of folks to like help our organization flourish, that's useful. But sometimes you need to break the rules, right? Like maybe someone needs to take extra vacation because their family member's sick, right? And so we need to have some compassion, right? Because that's important for protecting our employees too. And there's no clear way of deciding, when to do each, and so I'm trying my best here. I think like that's what you need to convey as a leader. Like ultimately you're trying to protect, and you're not just following rules or making a decision because like that's the way it's done, but really because of this desire for protection.
Cool. And I think all this discussion about morality has to lead us to a discussion about AI, right? Because every discussion seems to lead there. So AI is playing a growing role in decision making, right, across lots of different domains. How does psychology help us understand the risks of delegating moral or ethical choices to algorithms?
My other hat as a researcher is exploring kind of the ability for AI to capture human moral judgments. And we have a bunch of papers about how increasingly, recent iterations of GPT can make moral judgments and provide moral justifications, as well as elite ethicists, like the New York Times, the ethicist, who grapples with these kind of like moral quandaries, these thorny issues, right? GPT can justify its decisions as well as a professional ethicist, I think, which is pretty striking. But people still don't like AI to make these moral judgments. And the reason is because we deeply believe that moral judgments need to be made by human minds with, right, this concern about protection, with emotion, right? GPT doesn't have emotion, but people do. So if a leader makes a decision and says, look, I'm concerned about our future, that's a feeling. I'm worried about protecting our employees, that's a feeling, right? But I'm hopeful of moving forward, like also a feeling. And so I think the way to understand this aversion to AI kind of moral judgment is that people want feelings involved, right? They want some kind of emotion. And so I think that's what leaders need to think about too, if they're going to use these tools, is really kind of thinking about the emotions that should be behind these things and are often lacking when it comes to AI.
So if we think about the discussion we had earlier about exposing your thoughts about how you're making a decision and what goes into the decision, um, would it be, I mean, I've written that I think that part of what we need to do with AI is get clearer about our own moral foundation. Like and if, if we're making decisions based on trying to protect ourselves and avoid harm, then if we expose that more in what we do, then we can better articulate how we want any AI model to do that on our collective behalf, right? Is there some work that you're doing that if we're better at understanding the human side of it, that we can translate that into how we want AI to behave and act and make decisions?
Yeah. In fact, we're doing things on that right now, right? So this book, Outraged, is all about how our minds make moral decision, right? This kind of simplifying framework that it's all about perceptions of harm. Now, this is not really in the book, but I have other kind of academic work, more academic work on how you can break down this understanding of harm, questions of intention and vulnerability, right? Like, are you worried about a child? Or, a wrestler who's like a little less vulnerable than a child, right? And how are you causing harm? How are you causing help? And you can take those kind of elements and you can put them into LLMs to constrain the model a little bit. And it turns out that people trust those models more because they reflect our psychology, right? There's a question when it comes to LLMs about opacity. It's a black box. And so this kind of, what we call alignment really helps to make people trust AI more when it comes to kind of moral advice.
Yeah, it's interesting. If the LLMs are trained on what they see in society and how they internalize it, I worry a little bit about the us versus the them and the outrage and the polarization growing, that ends up being the thing that's more training the model than the behaviors that we want to see between people.
It's true, right? So LLMs pick up, well, ideas in the ether, including kind of polarization. But I do think, that a lot of folks who are developing these, and we're working with folks at like Microsoft Research, for instance, right, are genuinely committed to not only kind of capturing our kind of psychological moral judgment, but also putting, some guardrails in place to make them kinder and more humane than even sometimes people can be, right? So I've been in these conversations about how do we think about morality and AI. And on one hand, folks hold up this idea of like, well, humans are so special, we're incredible, and like AI can never kind of capture this human complexity. On the other hand, psychology and other thinkers for hundreds of years have been like, well, humans aren't so great. We're not so great at acting ethically. We're often not moral. We're often, ruthless and callous. And so I think between those extremes, there's room for LLMs to kind of like respect the powers of the human mind, but also hopefully try to avoid some of its darker nature.
Well, here's my call to everyone working on LLMs: train them with Kurt's books and research.
Thank you.
Have them take in a dose, emphasize them in your training, and I think that works. So I want to one last question about the future before we go to my closing questions, because we talked about AI, and I think we already sort of delved a little bit into the future. But when you think about the future, what excites you the most? And what do you think will be the biggest moral challenge we'll need to navigate together?
I guess my answer would be similar for both those sub questions, which is, I'm really excited by this idea of pluralism, right? And it's a very old idea. America was founded as a pluralist democracy, right? You need lots of different viewpoints in a country to make sure it finds the right path, right? Because no one wants to live in a dictatorship, or at least very few people do, and I think it's a bad thing to want. And I think organizations are often the same way, right? I mean, you need a board that has different ideas. You need employees or VPs that have different ideas so that you can explore the entire space. And ultimately, you need to make a decision, of course, right? But sometimes those decisions disagree when it comes to morality too. And so I think I'm excited of the kind of maintaining pluralism and like really respecting this, the messiness of disagreement, because I think out of that messiness, some of our best ideas, even if they're compromised, can arise. And of course, the biggest challenge in finding those good ideas that sometimes lie in compromise are really motivating this kind of outrage that people feel when they feel like their moral convictions are not being followed 100%. So I think that's the kind of promise and challenge of these kind of like of a moral pluralistic society or organization.
Awesome, awesome. All right, let's jump into my three closing questions, the same questions I try to ask all of my guests. The first one is, as you look ahead, what's one leadership skill you believe will be even more important in the future?
I guess to go back to what we were saying, I think kind of explaining your thoughts and feelings behind something, right? I think especially as as a leader in my lab, I'm more likely to kind of like use AI a little bit to help, write emails a little bit. And I think it can craft it in a really powerful way. It makes it easy, but those emails don't always convey what I'm thinking, right? And so there's a difference between like a beautiful, well-written email that kind of covers your ass in a way, and an email that like really conveys your motivation for something. And so I think increasingly leaders will need to say, well, how this decision is motivated by this desire for protection of their team and their organization. And I think that's going to be ever more important.
Yeah, and I want to jump in on that one a little bit. And usually I don't do follow-ups on these final questions, but when it comes to using AI, right, and maybe to write a letter or an email to the organization, this is a place where I think that we can rethink using it in a more powerful way. If we want to make sure that we are always conveying our thinking and our intentions, right, we could just train our AI or prompt it, depending on how we want to use it, and say, look at this email, make sure I'm sharing my intentions in a way that the people receiving it will understand it, right? We can I think if we can be explicit and meaningful about it, mindful about it, then we should be able to use AI to help us that way, no?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, this also gets back to the point we talked about a little earlier about like this kind of alignment, right? AI aligning with our kind of human cognition. And so we can kind of, as you say, make sure we prompt it and encourage these models to kind of reflect our thought process and our deep kind of emotions about protection behind our decisions. Great point.
Cool. Okay, now I give all my guests the magic wand for a little bit. You can use it. I take it back because it's too dangerous for you to have going in your normal life. But if I gave you this magic wand and you could wave it to make organizations more humanity-centric, what's the first thing you'd change and why?
I think I would use it to put in a pause between when people see an action or hear of an action, read an email, see a team member do something, and people's reaction to that perception. And in that pause, I want people to think about why is someone doing this, and that why should be charitable and have the best intention, right? And so often, like we see something, we get immediate reaction, we get immediate kind of like, ugh. And then the why we come up with follows that like gut anger, right? And it's usually something negative. So I think just putting in a pause where you can, I teach kids this too, in my kids, like just, well, do you think your sister really meant to do this? Or like, think about it for just a sec. And then you can really come up with something more charitable. And I think for adults, right, we're like, well, we don't need to do that. But I think we do need to do that, right? And just think about, just for a moment, a pause of like, well, what is a good charitable reason why someone might want to do this? And I think that could be the start of really changing organizations, right? Because you don't get these snowball effects of negativity, right? It starts off with something more positive.
But sometimes my sister really just took the cookie because she wanted it more than she thought I did.
That's true. Sometimes it does happen, right? But even just that pause can help you not lash out back at your sister. But yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Awesome. Last question. For leaders inspired by your work, what's one final piece of advice you'd leave with our listeners?
Just to resist the temptation to think that because someone disagrees with you, that they are not moral. And so not everyone has family, for instance, that disagrees with them, and that you can like recognize that they're still good people. And so I think just kind of keep that in mind, right? It goes back to the kind of why question a little bit, right? But just to understand that folks on the other side are still trying to protect themselves. And I think the heuristic you can tell yourself, whether this is about politics or just someone who advocates for a different policy, in your organization, it can just be about what harms do they see? What threats are they worried about? And when you ask yourself that question about the mind of someone else, it unlocks so many doors about how to think about them and how to act towards them. So I encourage folks to do that.
Awesome. Thank you, Kurt. This was amazing.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you found my conversation with Kurt Gray as insightful and thought-provoking as I did. His research reminds us that the most challenging decisions leaders face aren't just strategic, they're deeply moral and human. Building trust, fostering empathy, and navigating complexity all come down to understanding how people think, feel, and judge. If you enjoyed this discussion, please share it with your colleagues and friends who are thinking about ethical decision-making, organization culture, and how to lead in ways that bring people together. And don't forget to subscribe for more conversations that explore what it really takes to create sustainable success through people. Now let's head into the after show, a space where I'll reflect on the key insights from my conversation with Kurt and offer some thoughts on how leaders can apply these ideas to inspire trust and unity in their own organizations. Thanks for joining me in the after show. Our conversation with Kurt Gray was packed with fascinating ideas, and I want to take a few minutes to reflect and pull out 5 key insights that I think every leader should carry forward. First, everyone's moral compass is shaped by their perceptions of harm and protection. This might seem obvious at first, but the nuance is powerful. What one person sees as protecting their values, another might perceive as threatening theirs. And the real danger comes when we assume those who disagree with us are acting out of malice, rather than simply seeing the world through a different lens of what feels harmful or protective. As leaders, that's a call to step back, seek understanding, and resist the instinct to vilify disagreement. Second, we're far less divided than it appears. The polarization we see in the media and social feeds is amplified by what Kurt calls conflict entrepreneurs, those who profit from division. In reality, most people, whether in society or inside organizations, share common ground. The challenge for leaders is to draw out that noise and foster spaces where these quiet commonalities can surface and be nurtured. Third, facts don't bridge divides. Personal stories do. I loved Kurt's reminder that vulnerability and personal experience are far more persuasive than statistics. In leadership, this means we need to stop relying solely on data and start telling the human stories behind our decisions. When people understand the personal stakes, they're more likely to listen, empathize, and move forward together. Fourth, power reduces empathy, and leaders need to fight that tendency actively. The more authority you have, the less naturally you think about the feelings and perspectives of those around you, simply because you don't have to. This is a leadership trap we must consciously avoid. Leaders should intentionally build habits and systems that keep them connected to the emotions and experiences of their teams. And as Kurt suggested, part of that involves making your own thought process visible, sharing not just what you're doing, but why. And fifth, the pause matters. Kurt's magic wand wish was to give everyone a pause between perceiving an action and reacting to it. A moment to consider a charitable explanation for someone's behavior. Imagine what that could do inside of an organization. Fewer knee-jerk reactions, less resentment, and more space for curiosity and understanding. It's simple, but profound advice, and I think it's something every leader should work to model and reinforce. Taken together, these insights highlight a path toward organizations where moral complexity isn't something we shy away from, but something we acknowledge and embrace, where disagreements aren't threats, but opportunities to uncover new solutions, and where empathy and transparency aren't buzzwords, but operating principles. So I'll leave you with a question. In your role, whether as a formal leader or simply as someone who influences others, how can you build more spaces for understanding, tell more personal stories, and create that crucial pause before judgment? That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Thanks for tuning in to Humanity at Scale, Redefining Leadership podcast. Remember, true leadership isn't only about achieving short-term results. It's about creating a lasting, positive impact on all of the people you touch. Join me next time as we uncover more insights and strategies for humanity-centric leadership. Until then, I'm Bruce Temkin, encouraging you to lead with purpose and empathy and to be the spark that elevates humanity at scale.